before I get to the topic at hand, let me talk about another explosive development in our indagine, as the Italians say, our investigation into what is going on with the evidently missing text of the Third Secret of Fatima. Father Gruner got a copy of the book by Cardinal Bertone that Mr. De Carli came here to launch, the second edition of L'Ultimo Vigende di Fatima, which has been retitled L'Ultimo Segreto di Fatima. And he discovered in the introduction, it was also in the first edition, the letter from the Pope that Mr. De Carli touted as an authentication of Cardinal Bertone's position. Now, you remember yesterday we had a little conflagration over the issue of whether the authentication by Sister Lucia involved fogli, several pages, meaning that we have not seen one of these several pages, or foglio. And you'll remember that Mr. De Carli said yesterday that they had corrected the mistake in the first edition, where, according to that edition, Sister Lucia had authenticated fogli in a meeting with Cardinal Bertone in April of 2000, meaning that there's at least one page we haven't seen. Now, Mr. De Carli says that error has been corrected, and we're only talking about foglio. Now remember, when you take a folio and fold it in half to make 4 reading pages, it's still a folio. It's piegata, it's folded, but it's still a folio. So the new position they've taken is, yes, of course, it was always a folio, not fogli. We made a mistake. But the papal letter introducing this book says the following, that the Pope has prayed intensely over le parole autentiche della terza parte del segreto di Fatima contenute nei fogli scritti da Suor Lucia. In other words, the authentic words of the Third Secret of Fatima contained in the folio, plural folios, or sheets, written by Sister Lucia. So we're right back to where we started from. Oh, what a tangled web we weave, as the saying goes. So let's get to the topic at hand. There's one other item I would like to cover concerning that topic. This is from my first talk. I want to clear something up. I might have confused you because I was trying to do things chronologically. So I said there was a letter in 1977 from Monsignor Capovilla revealing that there was a text of the secret in the writing table of John the 23rd's apartment, and another letter from him in 1977 to the same effect. And then I jumped to a letter in 1985 from the photographer Saru, who said that Mother Pasqualina had told him, it is exact, that she told me, in there is the third secret of Fatima. In there will be the wooden safe. So to make things clear, what happened is, when John the 23rd died, the text went from the wooden safe in his apartment to the writing desk called Barbarigo in the bedchamber of John the 23rd. But it remained within the papal apartments. So there's a bit of confusion there, and I wanted to clear that up. There were 2 locations within the papal apartment, the safe, the wooden safe, and the writing desk. Now, another thing developed in the course of our investigation here, and this is the point I want to make before I proceed to the topic at hand. We're up to 6 envelopes now for this one text that they say is the entire third secret. We have the sealed envelope bearing Sister Lucy's writing, by express order of Our Lady. This envelope can only be opened in 1960 by the Cardinal Patriarch. We also have a second sealed envelope containing the same warning, one inside the other. We have an unsealed outer envelope by Lucy addressed to the Bishop of Fatima. That's envelope number 3. We have the Bishop of Fatima's outer envelope. We have an envelope marked Third Secret of Fatima, referred to in L'Ultima Vigente, which has never been seen. And we have the Capovilla envelope, which has never been seen. So now we have 6 envelopes, so they tell us, for the one text, 2 of which have never been seen. And number 3 rather, the unsealed outer envelope by Lucy addressed to the Bishop of Fatima was never seen until 2007. No one ever mentioned that. So 3 new envelopes have come out of the top hat during the chain of events here. And I find it incredible that we're being asked to believe we have only one text, but 6 different envelopes. Follow the bouncing envelopes, folks.
Who are you talking about when you say
They, meaning the people who sustain, as De Carli does, that we have only one text of the third secret of Fatima. The text of the vision and nothing else. Okay, so the topic at hand. Has the consecration of Russia been done? Here, too, we're dealing with a question of assembling evidence. The evidence is there, and if you assemble it, you arrive, just as you do with the third secret issue, you arrive at a complete picture of what happened. And you begin with the proposition that Our Lady requested the consecration of Russia, not the world. Now, I belong to this contingent in the church that is called traditionalist. Traditionalist is somebody who basically continued to practice the faith as if the Second Vatican Council had not given us new dogmas or a new way to worship, which it did not. The Second Vatican Council did not change anything about the faith. And it has caused some confusion in the church, but certainly it didn't make the faith something other than what it was before 1962. That's impossible. Now, what is a traditionalist then? A traditionalist is someone who states the obvious, that the council did not change the Catholic faith. No council can change the faith. And we make a lot of statements of the obvious. We have also said, for example, that if you look at the Roman documents, Paul VI clearly never de jure banned the Latin Mass. It just isn't there, this imaginary ban on the traditional way of worship in the church. And we maintained that for 4 decades. Those who came before me, I maintained it. Those who came after me will maintain it now because the Pope has admitted it. In 2007, in Summorum Pontificum, he said that the traditional Latin Mass had never been abrogated, and in his explanatory letter, he said, in principle, it was always permitted. So that particular fraud upon the church was exposed by the Pope himself. So that was another statement of the obvious. And concerning the consecration, we make still another statement of the obvious. Call us sticklers, but we maintain that if you're going to consecrate something, you need to mention it. That's our position. And if you don't mention Russia, then you haven't consecrated Russia. I don't think that's a difficult position to defend. All you need prove is that Russia has not been consecrated by name in order to establish that there has been no consecration of Russia. That is our case in a nutshell. And we know Russia has not been named, even though Lucy made it clear that Russia had to be named. In 1947, she said, Our Lady did not ask for the consecration of the world to her Immaculate Heart. What she demanded specifically was the consecration of Russia. And the source for that is Our Lady of Fatima by Professor William Thomas Walsh, a multi-bestseller. It sold at least 1 million copies. She said in the same book, but Sister Lucy said more than once, and with deliberate emphasis, what Our Lady wants is that the Pope and all the bishops in the world shall consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart on one special day. If this is done, she will convert Russia and there will be peace. Moving forward in time, 1949, she said, no, not the world, Russia, Russia, correcting one Father Thomas McGuinn. And that's found in the Vision of Fatima, page 80. Look at the bottom of these slides, you'll see the source for everything. I won't enunciate each source. We want to save time today. 1952, the Virgin Mary to Sister Lucy in May 1952, according to her diaries. Make it known to the Holy Father that I am always awaiting the consecration of Russia, not the world, not youth in search of meaning, not the unemployed, as we have heard in various consecration ceremonies, but Russia. Without the consecration of Russia, Russia will not be able to convert, nor will the world have peace. 1978, L'Osservatore Romano, the semi-official newspaper of the Vatican, reported the following. Father Umberto asked Sister Lucy, has Our Lady ever spoken to you about the consecration of the world to her Immaculate Heart? This is L'Osservatore Romano, the semi-official Vatican newspaper. Sister Lucy's answer. No, Father Umberto, never. The COVID area in 1917, Our Lady promised, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia. 1980, Sister Lucy writes to Father Umberto to clarify the matter. In replying to your question, I will clarify. Our Lady of Fatima and her request only referred to the consecration of Russia. Again, L'Osservatore Romano. And in the L'Osservatore Romano, there was published Sister Lucia's handwritten note. You'll see the call out there. Our Lady of Fatima, in her request, referred only to the consecration of Russia. Now, what did Sister Lucia say about the ceremonies that were done in 1982 and 1984? Let me pause for a moment and note that in the commentary on the Third Secret of Fatima, called The Message of Fatima, that was published along with the text of the Vision of the Bishop in White, Monsignor Bertone and his collaborators published exactly one piece of evidence which they purport to use to prove the claim that Sister Lucia changed her mind and later agreed that a consecration of the world is a consecration of Russia. And that one piece of evidence was a letter from November 1989. I forget the exact date in 89. I think it was November 17th, 89. It's referred to as letter of blank date, November 1989. No addressee is mentioned. And according to this letter, which was printed on a computer that Sister Lucia did not use, she had changed her mind and said that the consecration has been accepted, whatever that means. But no one ever asked Sister Lucia to authenticate that letter. No one ever asked Sister Lucia from the Vatican side of this debate to not only authenticate the letter, but tell us directly, as of 2000, that she had changed her mind. And change her mind she would have to do because we're going to go through her testimony. March 19th, 1983, Sister Lucy to the Papal Nuncio regarding the ceremony in 1982. In the act of offering of May 13, 1982, Russia did not appear as being the object of the consecration. The consecration of Russia has not been done, as Our Lady had demanded it. I was not able to say it because I did not have the permission of the Holy See. Now, Sister Lucia is a cloistered nun, trained to obedience. She would not speak in opposition to the orders of her superiors. Keep that in mind. She is not going to contradict them publicly unless she is given permission to do so. Without that permission, she will not speak. Keep that in mind. That's the source for that particular quotation. 1984, after the 1984 ceremony, or 2 days before, rather, she was speaking to her friend, Eugenia Pastana, and she was aware of what was going to happen, another consecration of the world, and she said, that consecration cannot have a decisive character, meaning there would probably be some benefit from it, but it would not have the decisive character required to bring on the conversion of Russia and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. This is in 1985, 18 months after the 1984 ceremony consecrating the world without mention of Russia. Question to Lucia, has he not therefore done what was requested at Tui in 1929 when Our Lady came to say the time has come for the consecration? And her answer, there was no participation of all the bishops, and there was no mention of Russia. Question, so the consecration was not done as requested by Our Lady? Answer, no. Many bishops attached no importance to this act. So this is 18 months after the 1984 consecration ceremony, and she said quite simply, the bishops didn't participate, and more important, Russia wasn't mentioned. How do you consecrate a place without mentioning it? July 20, 1987, on her way to vote, as commanded by her superior, she told the journalist Enrique Romero that the consecration of Russia has not been done as requested. 2 years before the mysterious computer-generated letter appeared, she was still maintaining that the consecration had not been accomplished because the object of the consecration, Russia, was never mentioned. What does John Paul II say about this? We've heard it suggested, never directly from the Pope himself, that the Pope has deemed the consecration to have been done. The Pope nowhere has ever said that. On the contrary, he's implied and practically stated explicitly quite the opposite. Let's look at the evidence. May 19, 1982. 6 days after the 1982 consecration of the world, John Paul II states, I tried to do everything possible in the concrete circumstances to emphasize the collegial unity of the Bishop of Rome with all his brothers in episcopal ministry and service in the world. Those are the words of someone who is laboring against what appears to be an impediment to the mention of Russia in this ceremony. And we'll encounter that impediment in a few moments. And the source is provided for that as well. March 27, 1984, L'Osservatore Romano reports that during the act of consecration of the world on that date, our Pope spontaneously added the words, "Illumine especially those peoples of which you await our consecration and entrustment." Why would he spontaneously add a reference to Our Lady awaiting a consecration that he was in the very act of performing? Now, some might say that's ambiguous. He was talking about what he was doing right then and there, but we know that several hours after, in St. Peter's Basilica, before thousands of witnesses, when the ceremony was over and done with, he said, "We wish to choose this Sunday, the third Sunday of Lent, 1984, still within the holy year of redemption, for the act of entrusting and consecration of the world, of the great human family, of all peoples, especially those who have a very great need of this consecration and entrustment, of those peoples for whom you yourself are awaiting our act of consecration and entrusting." So she's still speaking of Mary expecting a consecration of Russia. He's still speaking of it hours after the 1984 ceremony. He said this in Avvenire, March 27, 1984, the official publication of the Italian Bishops' Conference, not a Fatimist source, not a traditionalist source, but an official episcopal publication in Italy. "We have been able to do all this according to our poor human possibilities and the measure of human weakness, but with immense confidence in your maternal love and immense confidence in your maternal solicitude." So, hours after the ceremony, he is talking about something that has yet to be done, a consecration of Russia, and the source for that is Avvenire, the official episcopal publication in Italy. So let's look at what he has said between 1982 and 1984. In 1982, he's saying that he tried to do everything possible in the concrete circumstances. And in 1984, he says that he acted according to poor human possibilities and a measure of human weakness. A kind of a code language for the problem he was having affecting the consecration. And the problem, as we will see shortly, is the advice of his advisors, not to mention Russia. The advice was given by Cardinal Tomko and was reported in Inside the Vatican. I personally confirmed this with the editor of Inside the Vatican, Mr. Moynihan. And Tomko confirmed that Rome fears the Russian Orthodox might regard it as an offense if Rome were to make specific mention of Russia in such a prayer, as if Russia, especially, is in need of help when the whole world, including the post-Christian West, faces profound problems. That's from Inside the Vatican, November 2000. Now, think about what has happened here. The Pope has been given advice not to mention Russia for fear of offending the Russian Orthodox. So what happened in 1984 was a ceremony from which any mention of Russia was omitted precisely so that no one would think Russia was being consecrated. And this, we're asked to believe, is the consecration of Russia. But we have confirmation from within the Vatican itself that the Pope was specifically advised to avoid mentioning the very object of the consecration that heaven has charged the Pope with effecting. And as a result, there has been no conversion of Russia since 1984. I'll go quickly through the evidence for that proposition. John has covered some of it, focusing on the moral situation in Russia. I'll touch upon that, but I'll talk about some other things as well. First of all, there's been no religious conversion. And when Our Lady came to Fatima to speak of the conversion of Russia, she was speaking about a conversion of that nation to Roman Catholicism, a return to unity with Rome. A miraculous conversion of an entire nation, which has happened before, as we know, in Mexico, with the conversion of 7 or 8 million Aztecs who were worshiping pagan gods and committing human sacrifice until she made her miraculous appearance on the hill in Tepeyac and her miraculous image, the mere sight of which produced conversions, brought about the Catholicization of an entire nation within the span of 7 or 8 years. Well, it's been 26 years since the so-called consecration of the world in 1984, and there's no sign of a religious conversion of Russia. The evidence for that is overwhelming. First of all, if anything, the situation of the church has deteriorated since 1984. In the Washington Post, November 14, 2000, 16 years after the so-called consecration of Russia, we read of the effects of the 1997 religion law that discriminates among religions and violates Russia's international commitments. The Washington Post, a liberal newspaper, is saying this. Not the traditionalists, not the Fatimists, but the liberal Washington Post. It restricts the rights, powers, and privileges of smaller or newer or foreign religious communities. And one of those foreign religious communities is deemed to be the Roman Catholic Church. And only traditional so-called religions in Russia are protected under this 1997 so-called freedom of conscience law. Russian Orthodoxy, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, not Roman Catholicism, which is treated as a foreign religious organization. A Russian bishop is expelled, as reported by Fides, CWN, April 20, 2002. Expelled from Russia, coming soon after the refusal to renew a visa of a Catholic priest serving near Moscow, and according to this article, that signals a Russian government crackdown on the Catholic Church. By September of 2002, 7 clerics have been expelled from the former Soviet Union, and that number sounds trivial, but it isn't trivial, because the Catholic apparatus in Russia is minuscule. The expulsion of those 7 substantially gutted the Catholic apparatus. There are almost no Russian-born priests in the Catholic hierarchy in Russia. Almost all of them have to be imported from out of the country, and you see a list of those who were denied access. Father Caprio, Bishop Mazer, Father Kragniak, Wisniewski, Makovich, and so forth. In February last year, another foreign Catholic priest who had been working in Russia, Polish citizen Father Stanislav Opiela, was similarly refused an entry visa, and he was serving as the secretary of the bishops' conference in that region, a major figure in the Catholic apparatus. And Keston has recently learned that a French monk, Bruno Maziolek, was denied an entry visa, bringing the number of clergy to 7, and he had been working in Russia for the best part of 10 years. He was kicked out. And Bruno was told that he was deemed a danger to the Russian Federation, which is why he was denied entry into the country. Religious liberty, therefore, is in serious danger in Russia. The National Catholic Register reported this statement by Archbishop Kondrushevich. Catholics in Russia ask themselves what will happen next. Are the constitutional guarantees valid also for them, including liberty of conscience and of the right to have their own pastors, which comprises inviting them from abroad, not forgetting that for 81 years, the Catholic Church was deprived of the right of forming and ordaining its own priests. He goes on to say, the expulsion of a Catholic bishop who has not violated any law surpasses all imaginable limits of civilized relations between the state and the church. Catholics today are a minuscule minority in Russia. According to the Vatican, there are 500,000 Catholics in all of Russia, and most of them are in Siberia, where Stalin sent them. In Russia, Protestants and Muslims hugely outnumber Catholics. Russia has 2 million Protestants today. They have 1,150 communities, 5 times more than the Catholics. John, I believe, mentioned there are upwards of 5,000 sects in Russia now. And that's how the enemy operates, by the way. The more sects, the merrier. Because the more sects you have, the less chance there is for an integral conversion of a country, because it's factionalized religiously. It's impossible for the Catholic Church to get a foothold when there's a multiplicity of sects. The number of Muslims in Russia, 19 million of them, is 19 times higher, or actually 28 times higher than the number of Catholics. Well, 38 times higher. We have 500,000 Catholics. A most ironic fact. There are 150 Roman Catholic parishes in Russia, in 1917. Today, 83. Here's a roundup of State Department statistics. The Russian Orthodox have 5,000 approved religious associations in the country. The Muslims, 3,000. The Baptists, 450. The Old Believers, a schismatic sect, 200. Roman Catholics, 200. That's only 130 more than the Hare Krishna people, who have 68. And that's the Russian embassy's own statistics. The situation has gotten even worse, not better, since the last time I gave this talk. The U.S. State Department reports that in 2008, the Russian government introduced new visa rules that allow foreigners with business or humanitarian visas to spend only 90 out of every 100 days in the country. Now, what does that mean, practically speaking? It means you have to be out of Russia at least half of the year, even if you get a visa to come back in every time. And that, according to the U.S. State Department, limits their, and that's a reference to the Catholic Church, Russian priests, limits their ability to work and significantly increases their expenses. That measure is aimed at the Catholic Church. They don't want the Catholic Church to sink roots in Russia, to develop parishes with priests who are there year-round. They want them coming and going and coming and going. They want to maximize the expense and the interference while pretending to grant religious liberty. What about the claim that Russia has, well, converted to Russian Orthodoxy? There's a remarkable resurgence of Russian Orthodoxy, we're told. The whole nation is going back to Orthodoxy. That claim is nonsense. Here's an article from Zenit in 2002. Russia is suffering a crisis of faith. 94% of Russians aged 18 to 29 do not go to church. And that statistic hasn't changed over the past 8 years. Now, there was talk of a great reunion of the Russian Orthodox Church with the autocephalous Russian churches in other countries. Wow, this is a miraculous development. There's a reunification of Russian Orthodoxy. But Yakov Krotov, according to this source, says he's skeptical about what the reunification can achieve, because he sees it as a political maneuver. The reconciliation is based less on religious values than politics. This unification is more a secular act than a religious act in the strict sense of the word, because on the side of the Kremlin, this unification is one more attempt to create the Great Russia. Russia as an international empire that unites Russians everywhere. There's a tactic that liberal and oppressive governments use, and that would be the instrumentalization of religion. The Russian Orthodox Church was forced to become literally an arm of the state under Lenin and Stalin, and that apparently is the intent here. They want to mobilize the force of religion for the creation of another Russian empire. And the Russian Orthodox Church will work closely with the Kremlin. There will be no opposition between Russian Orthodoxy and Putin. Oh yes, there's this fellow named Medvedev who claims to be president of Russia, but I'm not going to waste any time on Medvedev today. This is Putin's show. There's been no moral conversion in Russia. John has touched on the evidence of that. He mentioned that Russia has an enormously high abortion rate. It's actually the highest abortion rate in the world, 53.7 per 1,000 women. Even though there are more abortions in China, as an absolute number, in Russia, the rate of abortions is the world's highest. John mentioned the testimony of Father Maurer about women having had as many as 25 abortions, and the average will have 8 abortions or more. That's an incredible statistic. We heard about population decline in Russia. There's the graph indicating a decrease of 700 to 800,000 citizens each year. Why is Russian life expectancy low? Because Russian men are drinking themselves to death. And there's a fertility rate of 1.3 births per woman, when the replacement rate is 2.1. And as the BBC noted, not the Fatimists, not the traditionalists, the liberal BBC, who, if anything, would be in favor of abortion in Russia, there are 13 terminations for every 10 live births. That's genocide. We have Russian youths, because the situation is desperate, being encouraged to procreate. So they put them in this camp during one of these programs. Camp under the theme Nashi, meaning ours, and it's 200 miles outside of Moscow. 10,000 uniformed youngsters go there, and they have 2 weeks of lectures in physical fitness, and to put it as delicately as possible, 2 weeks of engaging in activities designed to increase the Russian population. Attendance is monitored with electronic badges, and if you skip out on 3 sessions, you're kicked out of the session. So is drinking. They're trying to impose morality now by force of law, because there is no religious conversion. 25 couples marry, they have a civil ceremony, they have the mass wedding, it's like the Moonies, and then they go into their tents to increase the Russian population. This is the measure they've resorted to in a desperate bid to stem the drop in Russian population. And this is what the Daily Mail says, another newspaper, secular source. Attempting to raise Russia's dismally low birth rate, even by eccentric seeming means, might be understandable. Certainly, the country's demographic outlook is dire. The hard-drinking, hard-smoking, disease-ridden population is set to plunge by 1 million a year in the next decade. And that was only 3 years ago. This article goes on to say, and this is a direct quote from the article, terrifyingly, the revived Soviet view of history is now widely held in Russia. A poll this week of Russian teenagers showed that a majority believe that Stalin did more good things than bad. Which brings us to the next topic. They can't prove a religious conversion. They can't prove a moral conversion. So they're claiming, okay, well, all right, there's a political conversion. Our lady didn't speak of a political conversion. She did not come to prophesy a triumph of the Immaculate Heart consisting of a regime change. Nevertheless, there is no political conversion either. We know that the Russian parliament has given approval to Putin's bill back in 2004, allowing him to appoint the governors of the various Russian provinces or regions. That will be like the President of the United States appointing the governors of the 50 states with no elections. And he defended reining in the private groups, as the New York Times reported. He advocated Russia's right to scrutinize foreign and domestic charities for their political activity, even as he promises that civil society in Russia should not suffer. And again, there is this fellow Medvedev who claims to be president of Russia, but we know that the man behind the seat of power is Putin, and that he's indicated that he intends to run for the presidency of Russia again, I believe in the 2011 election. He's now serving, of course, as titular prime minister. And this is a news item from Moscow News, July 7, 2006, that after Vladimir Putin became president, the major TV channels, the most important media because of their audience reach, were quickly brought under state control or shut down. State-controlled or state-friendly businesses have been buying up newspapers and radio stations. Outside Moscow, media outlets routinely come under the sway of the local governors. Remember, the ones that Putin appoints, well, the Kremlin appoints, most of whom are loyal to the Kremlin. Of course they are. There's no freedom to criticize the regime. One Diana Kokolova, editor-in-chief of a chain of newspapers in Russia, declared in 2008 that United Russia is like a tank coming down on the people. I feel like I'm returning to when I was young in the 1970s. That is, during the height of the Soviet era. And there's the source for that. Criticism of the regime is hazardous to health. From 2000 to 2008, 21 journalists have been murdered in Russia, according to the World Association of Newspapers. And now they're talking about the last stand of the press against government oppression. Kelly Tufthill says, quote, free press is under siege in Russia, in the article by that title. On top of this, we have a rehabilitation of good old Joe Stalin. Yes, they're bringing the old boy back. There was a nationwide poll in 2008 on the question, who is the greatest Russian of all time? And the winner is Joseph Stalin, the butcher of millions of Catholics and other Russians. And he dropped from first place because the MC said, look, start voting for someone else. And they did. And the other leaders in the poll, Ivan the Terrible and Lenin. This is the mentality that dominates the popular mind in Russia today. 54% of Russian youth agreed with the statement, Stalin did more good than bad, and half agreed with the statement that Stalin was a wise leader. This is the future of Russia. Russian youth, not the old-timers. Happy birthday, Joe. Time magazine reported on December 22nd, 2009, less than a year ago, an interesting event. A birthday party at the Ismailovsky Hotel for the former despot Joseph Stalin. Direct quote from the article. And at this birthday party, the room was packed beyond capacity with more than 2,000 revelers, some of whom wept as patriotic poems were read. And in the midst of these proceedings, what did we see? But famous actresses singing ballads with the backing of a full military orchestra, and towering over the stage was an enormous portrait of the birthday boy in his military regalia, adding an element of the surreal to the entire scene. Happy birthday, Joe. Now, naturally, for these reasons and others, Freedom House, the international human rights organization, has changed Russia's human rights rating from a 5 to a 6, meaning partly free to not free, due to, and I'm quoting from the report, the virtual elimination of influential political opposition and, within the country, and the further concentration of executive power. Freedom House continues. During 2004, President Vladimir Putin took further steps toward the consolidation of executive authority by increasing pressure on opposition political parties and civil society, strengthening state control over national broadcast media, and pursuing politically driven prosecutions of independent business leaders and academics. Toss them in jail. The government also announced constitutional changes, which I've already discussed. The governors will be appointed rather than elected officials, and Putin advanced plans to take over direct control of the hiring and dismissal of judges. He's got the entire government under his thumb. Russians cannot change their government democratically. That's the conclusion of Freedom House. Oh, of course they have elections. They're Soviet-style elections. Everyone votes for the anointed leader. And this is a situation that has developed particularly in light of the state's far-reaching control of broadcast media and the growing harassment of opposition parties and the financial backers. The Communist Party, other than Putin's party, is the only party in the legislature generally free of Kremlin influence. In the words of Gomer Pyle, surprise, surprise, surprise. And in the presidential election of 2004, state dominance of the media was on full display. There was no real debate, and Putin got 71.4% of the vote. Imagine an American presidential candidate getting 71.4% of the vote. That's a Soviet-style election. The New York Times on May 9, 2006, said quite simply, Putin has reversed the democratizing course set, however, clumsily and incompletely by Boris Yeltsin, and moreover, he's using the oil and gas reserves as tools of intimidation and blackmail directed at the former satellite countries of the so-called former Soviet Union. And here's a Russian spy on the selective Stalinism of Vladimir Putin in Foreign Policy magazine, a respected journal. And here's what he says. What, in your mind, is the difference between the system Putin operates and Soviet Russia? Kalugin said, Putin has partially restored the old Stalinist methods. The difference is Stalin used mass repressions. He would imprison and execute hundreds of thousands, millions. In Putin's case, it is more selective. Individuals who he finds too hostile or harmful for his rule. Putin has actually put the country back to the authoritarian state. It's not as bloody, but just as criminal as Stalin's regime. So there's been no conversion politically, and we've heard talk of Russia beating its swords into plowshares, and isn't there a miraculous turning away from militarism in Russia? And that too is nonsense. Now, the Russian military is something of a joke, but what isn't something of a joke is that Russia has nuclear missiles. You don't need a high-tech army, you just need working nuclear missile silos with missiles in them ready to go. But there are efforts to improve the on-the-ground military as well. And Newsmax reported one initiative, a groundbreaking treaty with China there is now a Sino-Soviet military alliance, a formalization of a military alliance between Moscow and Beijing, because the leaders of those two countries are frustrated with growing U.S. influence in world affairs. Of course, U.S. influence in world affairs is now on the decline, while this Sino-Soviet alliance is very much a reality. And the treaty supports Chinese military preparations and the Chinese strategic ballistic missile forces, which over the next 15 years will increase to 100 warheads deployed primarily against the United States. No one is looking at China. I remember once I was in the woods with my late father-in-law, and we saw a cute little bear cub. And I said, "Where do you think the mother is?" And he said, "Circling around behind us." China is circling around behind us in unison with Russia. And they held a massive military drill in 2004 to show what they can do. Russia and China will hold, and they did hold, a massive joint military exercise on Chinese territory in late 2005 involving state-of-the-art weapons. Well, they may have a kind of crummy army, but they have vast numbers of troops. Vast numbers, far more than we have. And we're engaged in all kinds of fruitless efforts to battle terrorism, which are draining our military resources and our budget. There's no way we could fight a two-front, a three-front, a four-front war. That's a situation that's just waiting to explode. When, we don't know, but surely that's in our future. And there's the confirmation that the Russian and Chinese forces held their joint exercises. Putin is touting Russia's missile capabilities. According to the Associated Press, Putin boasted that Russia has missiles capable of penetrating any missile defense system, and these missiles are hypersonic and can change their flight path. So it's pointless to try to come up with an anti-missile defense system. He's talking about hypersonic path-switching nuclear missiles. And they only need the high-tech missiles. They don't need the high-tech military to put an end to us all. And, of course, they've resumed bomber patrols, as the New York Times reported on August 18, 2007. The Russian Air Force would begin regular long-range patrols by nuclear-capable bombers over the world's oceans, resuming the practice after a 15-year hiatus. And Russia backed out of the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty. Hardly evidence of a martial conversion of Russia to a nation of peace. And so, in summary, there hasn't been a conversion of any kind in Russia. Not religious, not moral, not political, not military. And I ask, is this the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary? I don't think so. I think it could be called the scourge of Fatima's message unheeded. A good friend of mine, James Bendel, calls it the Fatima curse. It's almost as if by defying Our Lady's wishes and avoiding specifically any mention of Russia so that the Russians would not be offended, Russia has been afflicted with one scourge after another, and we've gone through the evidence for that, and is now in a worse condition morally and spiritually, if that were possible, than at any time since 1984. So what is the cure for this problem that Russia hasn't converted? There's only one cure. It's the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, with specific mention of Russia. And anyone who thinks that that event would not produce a miraculous outcome has forgotten the example of Mexico and has forgotten the power of the papacy allied to the grace of God, which can produce miraculous results, as it did not only in Mexico, but at the Battle of Lepanto, where the Pope had the whole church praying the rosary for the triumph against Islam. And in his book, The Fourth Secret of Fatima, Sochi predicts that when the consecration is done, and he agrees with us that it hasn't been done, we will see a triumph that exceeds even the one that occurred at the Battle of Lepanto. And I think it's fitting to conclude this talk with something else from Sochi's book. And I'll quote, "Can one say that God has revealed at Fatima his very special plan for these times of ours? Yes, this is emphasized from the beginning, with the apparition of the angel to the three children, preparing them for the apparition of the Blessed Virgin. The most holy hearts of Jesus and Mary have designs of mercy on you. Then the Virgin herself openly reveals this plan to them. God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. And Our Lady makes it known that, notwithstanding the deafness of men, The plans of God will always be accomplished. In fact, the message of Fatima concludes with the prophecy of a factual certainty. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. And what does that mean? It means, as Sochi writes, we find ourselves before a prophecy that announces a radical and extraordinary change in the world, an overthrow of the mentality dominating modernity, probably following dramatic events for humanity. Thus, a total change in modern history through the hearts of Jesus and Mary, which is here prefigured. And that's what we are here to talk about today. That's what we are here to pray for as Catholics. For we believe in the power of the Blessed Virgin Mary. We believe in her prophecy. We believe in the power of the papacy. And we believe that in the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph. Thank you.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you. And I wrote back to him and I said, I appreciate very much your interest, and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, rather Pius X, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture, that we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us, these things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before. Just looking at the Catholic Church, for example, the only other time in church history that comes close to this time is the Arian crisis, when 90% of the bishops were Arian. And there was only about 3 or 4 bishops who actually stood up, and the greatest of them all, St. Athanasius, was actually excommunicated by the Pope in 357 AD. Now, he wasn't really excommunicated because, as the Church has always recognized, as St. Thomas points out, that law is not something that just the legislator says. Law is the ordination of reason. It is for the common good. And as the Church law to this day points out, that no one can be punished if he doesn't commit a crime. So because Athanasius was standing up for the faith, because he was defending the faith, which was his duty to do, he could not be punished even if the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication. In fact, Liberius regretted his action, but Liberius is the first pope not to be canonized from the time of St. Peter to the year 357. It's well for us to remember then that we need not be afraid of the judgments of men if we are on the right side of God. It's a principle that we need to keep in mind. We also have to understand that prophecy is a function in the church. It's a function that will never go away. It's a function that must be respected, just as the apostolic offices must be respected. As St. Paul tells us in Ephesians, the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, not just the apostles. The role of prophecy is essential. Scripture tells us that we must not extinguish the Spirit. We must not despise prophecy, but we must test all things and hold fast that which is good. So that is why I've promoted the message of Fatima, not only because it's unique among all the messages, but of course it's been approved by the Church. As Father Joseph St. Marie pointed out here in Rome, he's the one who wrote the speech for the Pope in 1982 when he went to Fatima. Father Joseph St. Marie points out that it is the role of the hierarchy to judge, to test whether the prophet speaks the truth. But once the hierarchy recognizes that the message comes from God, then the Pope himself and the bishops are bound to obey, not the prophet, but God who speaks through the prophet to them. That obligation is primordial. that is not for us to say, I'm telling the Pope what to do. No, but Our Lady Fatima is telling him what to do. All I do is explain what it means. I answer the objections of theologians or others who haven't had the time to think about it. So when we get back to 1917, Our Lady comes. She comes and gives a message to show mankind the way to peace. She was asked, she was insisted that she come. She comes and she explains. And then for the next 95 years, we basically ignore her. So our Lord himself, in 1931, explained to the Pope and the bishops something, a lesson from history. He said, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like the King of France, they will follow him into misfortune. What is that example he's talking about, the King of France? On the 17th of June, to the very day, the 17th of June, 1689, our Lord spoke to St. Margaret Mary and told her to tell the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now the kings of France, there were 3 of them from that day, all ignored St. Margaret Mary's prophecy and our Lord's command through St. Margaret Mary. Even during her lifetime, St. Margaret Mary was known as a saint. She was well hidden, but her reputation for sanctity was well known among her contemporaries. And so, for them to ignore this, they paid with their lives. On the 17th of June, 1789, that's 100 years later to the day, the King of France was stripped of his authority by the Third Estate. 3 weeks later, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On the 20th or 21st of January, 1994, his head was cut off by the soldiers of the Revolution. And our Lord makes reference to this and says, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like him, they will follow him into misfortune.